How do I obtain errors and omissions insurance as an RIA? That is today's question on the Transition to RIA question and answer series. It is question number 46. Hi, I'm Brad Wales with Transition to RIA, and on today's question, we're going to talk about a very important topic and something most advisors have dealt with already their entire career. But if they're moving perhaps from a broker-dealer model that maybe they've been in that entire career path into the RIA space, all of a sudden this is a new variable that they will need to address because perhaps the entire time they've been at a broker dealer, it's been handled for them, and now they need to handle it on their own. And so what I'm referring to is obtaining errors and omissions insurance, commonly referred to as E&O insurance. And so that's what we're going to be talking about on today's episode is how, as your own RIA, would you obtain that coverage on your own? And so for those of you watching on video, I'm absolutely happy to have an expert on this topic. Scott Shannon of Windermere Insurance Group is joining us. Scott, thanks for coming on.
Hey, Brad. Thanks for having me.
Yes, certainly. And so I'll turn it back over to Scott here in a second to give a little intro on himself and his firm. But I did want to give just some thoughts on this topic in general. Again, it's very important, in my opinion, to have that E&O insurance. And again, for most of you that have been in that captive environment, you've had it all along. Your firm's either paid for it on your behalf, and don't think that was free. That was involved in your payout. Or perhaps if you're at an independent broker dealer model, while they might have supplied the access to it, you were paying for it separately, as a line item on your own. But I've had, and Scott, you'll probably mix in, unfortunately some horror stories you've maybe come across along the way of this is no different than any other insurance. You can't wait to be in a car accident to think you need car insurance. You can't wait for your house to burn down to need home insurance. And yeah, in the 99% or whatever the stat comes to of the time, it ends up being completely just an expense and you never see any benefit from it. But that's by design. That's what insurance is. And hopefully you never do have to have it, but you want to have that reassurance. And so just the one quick example I'd give, and certainly wouldn't name names, but I remember years ago, an advisor in that RIA space did not have E&O coverage, ended up having, and I forgot exactly what the situation involved, but it was obviously a problem with a client. It ended up being a complaint. And it ended up going on for years and cost an enormous amount of money. And the advisor did not have E&O insurance. He thought, I will never need this. This is an unnecessary expense. And I forgot what the specifics were, but it was the type of thing that E&O insurance would have generally covered. And I remember distinctly the advisor saying to me as he was just kind of mentally drained from this process, he said, I am for sure getting E&O insurance after I get over the other side of this hump. And I just remember thinking, you never want to be in that situation. You don't wait till the house burns down to say, I need some sort of coverage. And again, hopefully you never have to use it, but the idea is that it is there to provide you that peace of mind. So with that, we're going to dive into that topic here. And maybe if we could start, Scott, if you could give a little background on yourself and your firm, I think that would be helpful.
Sure. Well, again, Brad, thanks again for having me on today. Again, I work for Windermere Insurance in Charlotte, full service insurance brokerage, personal lines, commercial lines, benefits. And the area that I focus on is specifically financial services businesses. And within financial services, I would say it's 90% investment advisory firms. And we offer all types of insurance, as I mentioned a second ago. But the primary insurance coverages that are applicable to investment advisory firms are the professional and management liability coverages, such as E&O, errors and omissions, but also other coverages. Cyber is a big one, directors and officers. So it's a specialized. We believe that RIAs are a specialized business, and this type of coverage is specialized as well, which is why we set up a practice, say 7 years or so ago, to focus in this area.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that it is a unique type of insurance. So much so we're doing a whole separate episode here just on this topic. That no offense to more broad-based, insurance providers, but you definitely need and want that expertise to understand exactly this specific solution. So glad to have you on with your expertise, and looking forward to diving into questions with you. So to start with, if you could just walk us through what technically is E&O insurance, errors and omissions. I mean, what does that cover? What does it not cover? Again, a lot of advisors have had it, whether they knew it or not. But now, what exactly are they getting when they pay for it? What is it in general?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's basically not limited, of course, to RIAs. It covers a lot of different industries, and so a nice way to kind of think about it is legal malpractice, or doctors that medical malpractice. It's if you're getting paid to deliver a professional service, and you make a mistake. You do something that you're not supposed to do, or you fail to do something that you're supposed to do, and it results in a financial loss for your client, then that's what E&O is, also called professional liability. It's basically just to cover a client claim. And in the context of investment advisors, it's typically that you allegedly put them in the wrong investment. You didn't follow their orders, and it led to a financial loss. And this could be an actual mistake. It could, as I mentioned, as I alluded to, it could just be an alleged mistake. And so one of the real benefits of E&O is that if you got sued for somebody who felt that you made a mistake, even though it turned out that was incorrect, the insurance will cover you in the event that you simply have to spend money with lawyers to make this go away. So it's really just designed to your main job is advising your clients, and if somebody is unhappy with your service, and they feel like it's warranted to take legal action, and they do, then E&O is really designed to protect you from that.
And what exactly does it pay for? I guess obviously, if there's a true error and there's $50,000 that the market moved, but does it also cover things like the legal costs associated with defending such a claim, or is it just more of whatever the resolution is?
No, that's a good point, and I should have clarified that too. I mean, like say you make a trade error, that is typically covered as well. Although typically E&O responds if you got sued for somebody who wasn't happy, and an action that was taken. If in the context of a trade error, if you and this has happened actually more recently with the volatility in the financial markets. If a mistake was made, you fat fingered a trade and you realized it, and by the time you realized it and you go back in the market to fix it, the market's moved against you and it costs you money to do that. That is typically included in an E&O policy, but you need to make sure it is, because to your nightmare scenario you mentioned earlier, Brad, we saw one not too long ago where that coverage was not included. An advisory firm had made a mistake and they did not get coverage. So that's an important component. And that's what a lot of times people think of E&O in the context of a trade error. And that is true. That should be covered. But it would cover the legal expenses. It would cover if there was a settlement, if there was a judgment that resulted from the action. Then it's basically money from the insurance company to cover you for the legal expenses, as well as any kind of settlement that might or judgment that happens related to that case.
Okay, and that I think that's what the situation was with the advisor I referenced. That to make it even worse for him, it was a situation that I think he was eventually exonerated. Is not the word. That sounds as if there was some criminal thing, but he was found not at fault at the end of the day, but it was the legal fees that absolutely crushed him to reach to that point. So here's a guy that arguably never should have been on the receiving end of this issue to begin with. And then he ends up having, and I mean, it was 6 figures type legal fees. And again, he struggled with that, understandably. So how is E&O different in the RIA world versus the broker dealer world? So I worked at a large broker dealer for a number of years in my career. And, I know that was, I think they even self-insured it. They were so big that they self-insured, but they would still push the cost down to each individual advisor of kind of what they were put in there. But from what you've seen, someone maybe coming from that broker dealer world to that RIA world, what have you seen as the difference in how E&O works? At that broker dealer, is it like a group policy that they're kind of all tucked under, and then it's on an individual basis, or what have you seen in the difference there, broker dealer to RIA?
Yeah, that's a good question. And on one hand, those policies are the coverage is similar. I mean, as I back to the high level of what is E&O, it is designed to cover you if you made a mistake or were accused of making a mistake that led to a financial loss. Then if you work for a broker dealer and it was a commission trade, or if you worked for an RIA and it was more on the advisory side, that it should the purpose of the coverage is the same, to protect you from a financial loss for something that you did or that you allegedly did. In the RIA space, the policies are structured a little bit differently. They're basically written at the firm level, and it covers all the people that work for the firm. The folks that are coming from the BD space would probably be familiar with, they would be required to carry it through the broker dealer. They would tend to get a certificate that shows that they have coverage. Everybody that's a rep with that firm is going to have that coverage, so it's shared with all these other reps that are working there. And so there tend to be a lot more claims in the broker dealer space than there are in the RIA space. So the cost can end up being higher on the broker, depending on how it is passed down. It can tend to be somewhat higher if you compare it to what an RIA, if I would say an RIA firm with 5 advisors, what that might look like. So there definitely are differences, but at the end of the day, it is designed to kind of cover the same type of risk that your client takes action against you because they're unhappy with something that you did or didn't do.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think there does sound like there's some differences there, and that's why it's worth trying to understand what those differences are and how it plays out. And so we'll dive into here in a little bit, how that process looks to obtain, working with someone like you, how to actually get it. But at a more kind of macro level, so I'm an advisor, maybe I'm with the team, we're going to start an RA. How do I know how much coverage I need? And so the best example I thought of when I was kind of taking some notes was with health insurance. I'll give you an example. When I worked in that corporate environment for a number of years, and so health insurance was one of the company benefits, and so I didn't really scrutinize exactly how much was covered under one thing or another thing, because there's one plan and that was it, and kind of take it or leave it. So for better or worse, that was what I got, and so I think that might be the case with folks that have received E&O, or they're kind of been forced to buy it from their company's solution or whatever it is. And so now all of a sudden, if they're RA and they're coming to someone like you, it's kind of like, okay, well, how much do I need? And so I know when I started my own company and I went out to source health insurance, that was a whole new world for me, because it's like, oh wow, there's all kinds of variables here that I never paid attention to because I didn't have a choice before. So if someone comes to you and says, hey, how much coverage do I need? How do you walk through that kind of decision process?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we get that question all the time. And our observation is that there's not any real science in terms of how much you need. Typically, these policies are written with $1 million minimum. We have seen some as little as $500,000, but typically it's $1 million and goes up from there. And we have a table we put in our materials that shows our observation of coverage ranges, which is based mostly on AUM. So if you're a team that's breaking away and you've got, say, a couple $100 million of AUM, then we would normally see, say, $1 million of coverage, maybe $2 million. But what it also say is that this is basically transferring risk and your comfort with insurance. And to your point earlier, Brad, is that hopefully you never use this policy. High likelihood you would never use this policy. And so some people say, well, let's just get a policy with a minimum amount, just checking the box. I don't think it hadn't happened to me in my career, and I don't think it will, but I know I kind of need it, so I'm just going to go for the lower end of the range. Other folks might say, I've been maybe to your advisor that you mentioned earlier, or somebody's been around a claim and seen the insurance work, and then they might want to simply go for the higher end of the range. So It really just kind of depends, but that's what we normally would see with a team that's breaking away in those kind of AUM, the couple $100 million, $400 million. I mean, we've seen breakaways as high as $2 or $3 billion that would obviously carry more coverage, but it's mostly benchmarked to AUM, and I would say it's a very broad range because there's not necessarily a science that says, okay, this is the right amount. I mean, you want to make sure, like I alluded to earlier, legal fees can eat up an awful lot of limit if you got in a situation that was a complicated situation and you had to spend a lot of money to make it go away. You could eat through $1 million limit or a good chunk of $1 million limit reasonably quickly, and then not have a whole lot left over to cover if there was indeed some kind of a settlement.
Yeah, it's a great point on the not considering just the minimums, to be sure. And I always say, no matter what kind of insurance it is, when someone looks at the minimums, that you're signing up for the minimum, paying for the minimum, so obviously the lowest price, that works absolutely wonderfully right up until it doesn't. And so as long as you never need it, you luck out, you win. But then generally, if you are one of the percentiles where unfortunately it does come into play, it generally does not work out after that point. So certainly, I'm not suggesting people have to go out there and get the max deal, but I think it's worth looking at that range, talking to someone like you to understand, what others are doing, what the exposure, realistically is, and things like that. And thinking of the coverage. So if an advisor or advisors as a team goes out and sets up, and let's say there's a team, let's say there's multiple advisors involved, and they set up their RA, and then they come to someone like you to get, coverage. Is the policy, and I think I know what the answer is because you kind of alluded to this, but I just want to make sure it's clarified. Is the policy at the RIA level? So it's one policy for the RIA, or are each of those individual advisors having to obtain policies on their own?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And that's somewhat different than the broker dealer space. I mean, there's one policy. It is written. It's an ABC wealth management company is being set up. That's where the policy is written. Typically, the definition of who is covered is all the not just the advisors, but all the employees. So if you end up having a claim, then say an individual advisor made the alleged mistake. And so the client's unhappy, they're going to sue. They're going to sue everybody in sight, probably, and they're certainly going to sue the firm because that's where the presumption of deeper pockets, might be. So that's why the policy is written at the firm level, and then the advisors that work at the firm are almost always typically automatically covered for that. So you would have kind of the core policy sitting at the entity's name, and then by definition you pick up all the folks that work at the firm.
Okay, that dovetails perfectly then into my next question, because I was going to ask you on that one, and then I think it's going to just get caught up in my next question. What happens if they add advisors over time, or they double in size because they've grown over time? So that all comes back to kind of the pricing and then kind of that exposure. So how is something like E&O coverage priced out? I'm not expecting you to give any hard numbers because these things presumably fluctuate, perhaps daily as the marketplace shifts and if risks rise or not. So, if an advisor comes to you and says, okay, here's 500 million, whatever the case is, you mentioned AUM is one of those variables, but how is it priced out? What are the variables that go into determining what that price will be?
Yeah, that's a great question. Typically AUM is a big driver of that. And then within that, investment strategy is another one. So if you're a plain vanilla RIA with limited alternatives, no private fund that you might be managing, no major client concentrations, that's something that is looked at. If you're offering some what we call concierge services, if you're doing bill pay, or you're doing some tax prep work, or you're doing some trustee work, some policies exclude that or charge for it. So there's not like we're not privy to any kind of a grid that says this is how the pricing works exactly, but the AUM is the kind of the main point. A lot of times, if people come in the broker dealer world also would say, well, is it price per rep or per IAR in this context? And typically not. I mean, that if you had an inordinate number of IARs based on your AUM, perhaps that comes into play. But generally speaking, it's really AUM and investment strategy, and the less liquid and more esoteric of the investment strategy, then the more you might end up paying. But it's not as much based on the number of folks that might. I'm sure that's considered, but it's really not a driver.
Okay, and so those variables can change over time, right? So, I mean, how long is a typical policy? I mean, these written for 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, and then regardless, is there, if it is a longer period of time, is it wise to revisit those variables on some sort of periodic basis to say, hey, the practice has maybe changed? Are we still getting the coverage we need? What are you seeing there?
Yeah, almost always we see these policies written for 1 year. So you're back at the renewal time, and you're being asked some questions. Some of the carriers that we work with have expedited renewal process where they ask you like 5 questions, and they're big picture questions, like have you had a change in ownership, have you had an SEC claim, have you had a claim under this policy, or revenue grown by more than 50%, something like that might say, okay, if that's the case, then we need an updated app. If not, then we don't, and we'll just make a small increase. In today's market, pricing is a little challenged, so they might increase it slightly, or they might not increase it at all. But other carriers are like they want an updated application. If you have a lot of growth during the year, you say you bring a team on and you're adding more AUM. Typically, that's not something that's going to trigger. You have to go back to the carrier to get let them know what's going on. If you make an acquisition, then there tend to be some thresholds in there. If you buy a firm and it increases your revenue or AUM by more than say 30% or 35%, then you might have to go back to them, and they might reprice that because the risk has changed. But typically, if you're just organic growth, typically you're not going back. Now that might be would be factored in at the renewal if you're doing an updated application. And things have changed meaningfully, then you might end up paying more. But generally speaking, you've got a year to kind of run on this, and not have to really change much of anything until you go through that renewal process.
Okay, so you mentioned carriers, plural, and so does a firm like yours, someone comes to get your expertise to have you help them with this. Is Windermere itself an underwriter, or are you more of a broker where you're going out to the marketplace and saying, hey, here's the variables, and coming back to that advisor, that team, and saying, hey, here's what we're able to put together, or how's that structurally look?
Yeah. Windermere is a broker, so we're not a carrier. So but our job is to kind of go to the various carriers that are out there. I mean, being specialized and focused on RIAs and focused on the E&O and the cyber and these types of coverages, we know who the carriers are. It's not like getting home insurance where you could have literally 100 carriers that could potentially write that. I mean, it's a more finite group of carriers that would write E&O for RIA. So we would know literally all of those carriers, and not all of them are going to be active at any point in time. So we feel like our job is to understand the market, who's out there, who's being aggressive now, who's not being so aggressive. And then we would just go to, based on once we got an application and get the ball rolling, then we would go out to those carriers that we thought would provide the most attractive quote, and just make sure that we've covered the market, know who's out there, and deliver what we think is the best fit for the client.
So a couple steps then involved in that process. So and we can come back to the time needed for that, but what does that whole life cycle look like? So if an advisor calls you up tomorrow and says, hey, I'm starting an RIA, and we'll pick something reasonable, and then 4 months from now is when we launch. So again, we'll come back to the time and how that works. But what literally was the process? Someone calls you, maybe they've seen this episode, they've listened to it, they have a kind of a general idea. What's the process from that first conversation with you until they're getting their proverbial certificate, or whatever the official terminology is that they have coverage?
Yep, right. Generally speaking, we would say, like in this kind of situation, we'd have an early conversation with the team that's leaving, because a lot of folks may not have had to deal with this. Like you said, they might be coming from a wirehouse and they've got E&O, but they don't, they might, and set up their own firm, want to know more about it and understand the timing and the process and the cost so they can manage their budget, things of that nature. So we would have a conversation, ideally relatively early, just mostly to kind of answer questions, help them out, let them know what's entailed and how long it might take and what the process is. And the process is generally you fill out an application and then it takes 2 or 3 weeks to kind of get that from start to finish. So we would advise, generally speaking, that we'll have an early conversation, more I'd say an educational conversation. And typically the carriers won't hold a quote for more than 30 days. So in your example, Brad, if somebody was, some kind of meaningfully down the road, but still that 4-month target to be up and running, and we might have a conversation at that point, and just get more, I'd say, an educational conversation. They would say, all right, well, let's circle back within a couple months, 2 to 3 months, and we'll get an application. You fill that out, and then it takes 2 to 3 weeks. And we've done some of these as fast as a couple of days if the carrier is able and willing to do that. But we generally advise that it takes 2 to 3 weeks once we get the applications back to get the quotes, to go through them. We can common size them. We talk to the advisor and say, hey, we think this is something you might want to think about. This is a good fit. But a lot of times, I mean, we've had conversations and where like a group was a year away from setting up, and we've had conversations when it was a couple of days away from setting up. That's not ideal, but that can be done. Usually it's a comfortable, call it a 3-week process once we have the applications back. And the applications they'll take a little bit of time. And I know that the advisors that are setting up an RIA have a list as long as their arm of things that they need to do. So any time is a little bit of a distraction, but these are not terribly complicated applications. Take a little bit of time. Once they're back to us, then it's a 2 to 3 week process to be able to be ready to put coverage in place. That's a comfortable time frame. Again, we've done them much quicker if need be. And we've had mostly, and prefer to have, early conversations just to answer questions and make the advisors comfortable with what the process looks like.
Yeah, the fire drill approach is generally not good for anyone. And I am glad you certainly are cognizant of the fact that anyone going down the RA path, setting up their own firm, there's a lot of things they're doing. It's certainly something I help advisors with as they go down that path, but there are a lot of variables. And so things can get sideways. And so I think it is helpful to have that general idea of the timeline. And so it sounds like, just to recap on the time, that education conversation can never be too early. You're getting that started, you're getting lay of the land. But then it sounds like the rubber hits the road. You got to kind of wait to that last 30 days to really get a quote. But I assume even beforehand, you can give people a general idea of what costs might look like. You can't predict the future until ink is on paper, but that education session can at least help them set up to kind of be prepared for that. Nearing the end here, and I think I might make this an entirely separate episode because I think there's a lot to unpack with it, but maybe at a high level, if you could. So we've talked obviously E&O insurance. What other kinds of insurance? Like I said, we'll just do it high level here. Maybe I'll have you back on for a second one. We'll talk about some of these other coverages. But what other insurance coverages are you seeing or advising RIAs should be obtaining beyond just E&O?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are other coverages that are either worthy of consideration or potentially even required. And so like in a typical breakaway situation, we would say there are kind of 4 key coverages. And they're not always in play, but they are in play in a lot of situations. And on the other, in addition to the E&O, which is kind of the anchor, if you will, cyber is one that is I'd say critically important. Probably not required by anybody, but it's a good coverage to have. I'd say the vast majority of our advisory firms, even the smaller ones, now carry cyber. It wasn't the case 3 or 4 years ago, but that is a coverage, and it's reasonably priced for the value that it offers. That could be a whole other session as well about cyber and the claims and stuff that we've seen there. But that would be one. General liability, which is also called a slip and fall. Like if you have an office space and somebody's coming to visit, clients coming to visit, and they slip on some water that was left out and they break their neck and they sue you. that's one that's typically required by your landlord. It's very cheap, very easy, no application, but that's something that you might have to have. And then the other one you might have to have would be workers' comp, which is if any of your employees got hurt on the job, this is obviously it's not a construction job or something where there's more risk of that, but each state has a requirement, and it varies based on if you have X number of employees, then you have to have workers' comp. Another one that doesn't need an application is very, very standard, very generic, but again, that may be required. And so the E&O, cyber, general liability, workers' comp, that's kind of, I'd say, is the core package. But there are other coverages, like if you're doing any kind of ERISA work, you might need an ERISA bond, and that's something that comes into play. If you've got that kind of business, directors and officers can be added into the E&O. That's a good coverage in certain situations. There are a couple others as well that we could talk probably in more detail about at some point. But I think that when you talk to a lot of the breakaway advisors, that's kind of the core package of the four. And you're probably going to probably carry a couple of them, and maybe carry all of them depending on how many employees you have, what state you're in, et cetera.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. That's helpful. We'll definitely plan to do a whole separate episode because there's a lot there. Cyber insurance obviously is a meaningful topic to be discussed, and so we could dive into how that works, what that covers. So we'll plan for that. But I think it is helpful to at least kind of keep in mind that there are things beyond just E&O. And as I say, with a lot of the variables involved in starting your own RIA, well, some of this can seem daunting, such as like, oh gosh, how do I manage my compliance, or how do I manage, in this case, the insurance I need? And the reality is there's an entire ecosystem out there to support advisors with this sort of thing, which is, Scott, what you do. And there's a process for this. And so while a lot of this is new and, oh gosh, there's 4 different kinds of coverages and maybe there's other ones, well, there's a defined process for how to tackle this, how to work through it. And then there's experts like you to help them understand that. So this is nothing that should intimidate anyone. Again, most of these things you're paying for now, whether you realize it or not, it's either a line item expense being pushed perhaps to your expense blotter, or it's effectively in your payout. So these are not necessarily new expenses to be thinking about. But it is just something new, perhaps, to have to work through this on your own. And so I think hopefully this has been helpful in that regard for folks to at least get an initial taste for how this process works, the kind of people they can work with. And so, Scott, obviously, I think you do a great job with this. That's why I asked you to come on. I've seen some of the presentation decks. I know you've gone out there and given, and I think you're a great resource. So if this has resonated, people are going to need, if they go down this path, they are going to need arguably coverage, some of these other coverages. If someone likes what they hear, likes your message, and wants to reach out to connect to discuss this with you, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Well, the easiest way is probably just go to our website, Windermere Insurance Group, and all my contact information is on the website. And to Brad's point, we do an awful lot of this, and the carriers have been through the startup process. Sometimes we get the question, "Hey, we're a brand new firm. We got to fill out this application. We don't have a real history of financial of our own firm. Does that make it kind of awkward?" And answer is no. This is to Brad's point. This is a system, if you will, that all the carriers have seen. They're comfortable with. It's a process. We know you guys have a lot going on and a lot of other boxes you have to check. This is one that is not terribly time consuming or terribly difficult, and it's a road that's been traveled many times before. So I just call early. We're happy to get involved early in the process so you can understand how it works, figure out how you fill in the budget side of it, and then we can obviously circle back around as you get closer. But we're always happy to get involved early. Love working with these kind of startup situations. I think it's very exciting, and to be able to support advisors. They're leaving the mothership and getting out and get started. So we always love those opportunities.
Well, Scott, I appreciate you having or coming on and joining us and giving us this education. In the show notes, I will include the website. I'll include your contact information off your website as well. And so if you're not already there, if you head on over to transitiontoria.com, you can see all the episodes. You'll see this one again in the show notes. We'll have the contact information specifically for Scott, his firm, and certainly feel free to reach out to continue that conversation, dive into more details. And if you're not already aware, if you're watching this on video, you can also listen to all of these episodes, this one included, in podcast form. If you're not aware of it, the Transition To RIA I podcast, it's available on all major podcasting platforms. Would love to have you subscribe and download episodes, and certainly always open to feedback of any additional guests anyone would like to see on the show going forward. But for today, Scott, really appreciate you coming on and sharing all this expertise with us.
Well, Brad, thanks for having me. I very much enjoyed it, and always happy to help any way we can.